the attempts by the mainstream media in the United States, of course, by the U.S. government, often working hand in glove to raise the specter that, just about anything it seems that's happening is somehow tied to foreign meddling in elections or, different networks of people. Anyway, long story short, to get more into all of these points right now is Dr. Ben Becker, the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. As always, Dr. Becker, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's been quite a week just this week, forget the past month, of, major stories in the New York Times about Iranian disinformation, DOJ indictments of Russian media companies that are alleging that, various influencers are, unwittingly working for Russia or whatever it may be, allegations in major newspapers about, secret networks of Chinese government thugs that are allegedly nested within the Chinese American community. A real hornet's nest, it seems. And I think a lot of people may be wondering in good faith, Ben, is should they be concerned that they are being manipulated online, in the streets, and elsewhere by, malignant forces?
Yeah, they should be concerned they're being manipulated by malignant forces. Who those malignant forces are and the scale to which they operate is the real question. For instance, you have currently $500 million is going to be spent between Labor Day and Election Day on campaign advertising by the Democrats and the Republicans. Of course, it's perfectly legal to collect tens of millions of dollars from shadowy sources and spend it on manipulating the hearts and minds and feelings of the American people. And we have social media companies that have hidden algorithms that decide what will be boosted, what will be shadow banned. So there's a lot of manipulation and malignant actors to go around, to be sure. But I do think it's quite interesting, quite coincidental and strange that the very first days after Labor Day, when the official sort of general election period begins, the conventions are over, they're sort of in the sprint the last 2 months from Labor Day to Election Day, that all of these DOJ investigations and Washington Post investigations and New York Times investigations all came out in the same week. Isn't that amazing? After some of them took 6 months, some of them took a year, some of them took 9 months, and they all came out in the same week. It's almost as if there is a attempt to build a pre-election narrative to scare the bejesus out of everybody, that anybody who's thinking independent thoughts or critical thoughts may be the unwitting dupes of one of the adversaries of the U.S. government. Clearly, this is something, it's almost become tiresome. It has become tiresome at this point. People are, I think, used to it now for the last few election cycles. And it was obviously spun up for this one as a new sort of narrative that both candidates can use against the other. Both can say, well, Iran favors Kamala Harris, so now Trump's going to focus on that. And Kamala Harris can say that Russia favors Trump, and then she can focus on that. Both can sort of scapegoat this or that foreign adversary. Both can rely on their sycophants and loyal stenographers and this or that sort of media ecosystem to boost it. And so they both get talking points that allow people to think about the foreign enemy instead of the real problems at home and the enemies who we can easily name and number right down the street from us, for instance, on Wall Street. So I think that's the big picture when you step back from it, is that, it's not coincidental all of this is coming out right now. And then when you start to drill down into the stories themselves, just like in 2016, just like in 2020, the evidence is very thin. The evidence that does exist is often exaggerated, way beyond proportion. There's a lot of use of passive language. There's a lot of use of sensational headlines that don't match what's actually in the article. There's so many problems with a lot of these articles. I don't know, of course, what every government in the world is doing in the United States. I assume there is a level of influence operations that happens in the whole world. I know the U.S. does it. They have whole named agencies that are focused on influence operations. And I know that other governments can have them too. And I assume that the U.S. would be an interesting place where you'd want to have influence. So I don't doubt that there are influence operations at some level. But the question is, why is it being ginned up right now? How is it being exaggerated, and to what end? I think those are really the big questions that everyone should be asking when they're seeing this, is why is this being put in front of my face and in this way at this moment?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, not even speaking about just foreign meddling, though we could talk about some of that. I mean, you mentioned earlier all of the money that's being spent on these elections. And by sitting here focusing on some website or some meme that we're supposed to believe like Russia used to get you to vote for this person, or China or Iran used to get you to vote for that person, it distracts from the fact that we have a political system that is completely funded by various ruling class interests, whether it's whether it's a weapons company, or whether it's the Israel lobby, which is totally tied into the military industrial complex. And I saw many people making the point that you have AIPAC promising to spend $100 million on this election. That's a lot of money. And they're saying it, right? But then you've also got, various oil companies. And I mean, could you talk a little bit about the irony here, Ben, when it comes to what actually rules who we even get to vote for in the first place? Because there is a lot of funding and a lot of influence peddling happening there, but it's not coming from foreign adversaries necessarily.
Yeah, it's considered legal bribery. I mean, that's really what the lobbying industry really is. There's been the Princeton study quite famously established that, what the American public believes on this or that issue has almost zero bearing on whether legislation passes to that effect. Zero bearing, meaning if you have, but what does matter is the approval rating of this or that legislation among millionaires, basically, and among corporate giants. So you could, if you have like all the corporations are for a bill and none of the people are for the bill's still going to pass. And vice versa. If all the people want universal health care, but the corporations don't want it, it's not going to pass. So obviously we have basically a whole arm of government that's quite literally bought and paid for in the US Congress. And then these presidential campaigns are spending so much money, like a farcically high amount of money. And it's so much more than they even used to spend. And so it goes on and on. I mean, there's so many layers and levels to which sort of big money dominates politics and basically controls what the politicians say. I mean, just yesterday you had Kamala Harris reducing the capital gains tax plan that she had. I mean, who paid for that change in policy? Somebody paid for it, but it's not considered a big scandal. So, I mean, I think that's the big part of it. And then the other side is just the way the media is functioning in all this is, I think, really quite troubling. Like the story in the Washington Post about the Chinese, the incident when Xi Jinping visited San Francisco last year. I mean, here you had the media working with the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank, and with different CIA cutout kind of NGOs using facial recognition software and AI to recreate who was everybody who was at this protest, whether or not they were involved in any kind of criminal conduct, and trying to basically recreate who was at the protest, who spoke to who before this or that scuffle took place. This is an article that came out earlier this week. It showed that like there's this, it's sort of like the accusation is a confession. Here you have all these institutes, think tanks, media organizations working side by side with basically the government, sort of doing what the government would like to do, but sometimes can't openly do it because there's something called the First Amendment. But now you have all these other people doing it, and it's all in the name of catching the foreign adversary. So now you have, basically people's own free speech being shut down. They're being harassed, they're being doxxed in the name of catching the foreign adversary. So everything's sort of been flipped on its head. And you might be surprised to find out the American Enterprise Institute, which did a lot of the research for that article, received $500,000 in an undisclosed donation, basically, from the Taiwanese authorities. So, wouldn't you want to put that in the article that, one of the organizations that's supplying the quotes and the research to the Washington Post to go after Chinese American activists is actually being funded by Taiwanese authorities? And then they come after groups like us. They come after groups like Breakthrough and say that we're we're part of some foreign subversive plot. This is why this is a kind of a emotional and near and dear subject to all of us, all three of us here, because we're not, this is not some idle abstract discussion for us. There have been attacks on Breakthrough just the same, simply because we're putting forward essentially an anti-imperialist narrative. They say, well, now you are echoing the talking points of this or that state, and because you've appeared on this or that channel, therefore we are doing propaganda for this or that country. I mean, it's a huge logical leap, but if if it's sort of said over and over and over by these institutions that people are told they're supposed to trust, people start to sort of believe them. And I think that's the real danger to independent media and to free speech.
No, I think it's a good point. I mean, it's a thought police sort of thing. I mean, in the indictment that, captured some of these right-wing influencers who even the FBI said were unwitting, right? Like, didn't know the money allegedly was coming from Russia, which is, again, all allegations. I thought it was interesting. The exact phrase they used was, I think this was the exact phrase, that their programs sometimes coincided, quote unquote, with Russian talking points like their opposition to the war in Ukraine. I mean, why is Putin not responding to our talking points? Why is it only one? You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, it's like two people. So if I say the sky's blue and Putin says the sky's blue, that's a Russian talking point. I mean, there's a certain level of just like facts on the ground that people are going to come to certain conclusions. But I mean, to your point, Ben, it is the thought police, where it's like the only way that you can be sure that no one will ever accuse you of being a Russian, Chinese, Iranian, Hamas, Hezbollah, Cuba, Venezuela, let's just keep naming the countries, agent, is to just only say the things that the State Department, the FBI, and the CIA and the White House say. That's the only way you won't be accused. So it's like it feels very thought police-like to me.
Yeah, I mean, just think about it in history. If any time your opinions coincide with the opinions of a foreign government, therefore in some ways, therefore you may or may not be the unwitting or the witting agent of them and a foreign agent. Just think about how absurd that easily could get. I mean, it basically means that any opposition to the Ukraine war, for instance, where you might not want hundreds of billions of dollars going to fund another forever war. You might want that to go to people in need of housing or food or healthcare in the United States, or to develop countries and build them up in South and Central America. Or you might think that's a better use of the money and this is a complete gift to the military contractors. But if you make that point, you are coinciding with Russian talking points. I mean, I hope people can kind of see through what this is. But obviously, and then you take a step back even further. Okay, the U.S. is openly spending hundreds of millions of dollars helping civil society and media groups through the National Endowment for Democracy in over 100 countries. How much of that money do you think is going to anti-imperialist, anti-American organizations, Eugene? Do you think it's going to mostly those? Or I bet they're trying to build an echo chamber. If you go and look at who is the U.S. supporting in Botswana or Zimbabwe or Djibouti, they're probably looking for who are the influencers and media organizations that are raising doubts about Chinese influence in the country. I would bet that's where the NED money is mostly going. I don't think you're going to find a lot of support of pro-China media organizations if you go look into those NED grants. So therefore, I mean, they're basically doing the same thing openly. And if you are a country like Iran or Russia or China, just to think about it as like a thought experiment, the idea that if you're Iran, your ability potentially to sell oil to be able to provide for your country actually is contingent on who sits in the White House in Washington. Or if you're in Venezuela, or you're in any of these countries that are under sanctions, and literally whoever's sitting in Washington could determine whether your country goes into an economic tailspin or is able to survive. Well, in a way, it's like the empire has created its influence everywhere. And then it says, well, look, they're trying to influence us. They're trying to influence the empire. Like, of course, they're trying to influence the empire. It wouldn't surprise me if they were, because it would only be logical when you have your boot on the neck of those countries that they'd be trying to think of different ways to get your boot off their neck. So, I mean, there's that element is just, again, like really, do they think that, what kind of world do they think we're living in? The U.S. can just do this everywhere and no one's ever going to do it back. I'm not even saying any of it has legitimacy, but they're living in some sort of fairy tale world where we can influence the politics of every country, but everyone's supposed to basically just sit back and hope that U.S. politics turns out for the best for them.
Yeah. I mean, it's totally absurd. I mean, when you lay it out like that, it's totally absurd. But I guess that's why we had to start Breakthrough News, and you're not constantly being, brought onto CNN to lay these things out, because obviously it just so easily punctures what you get from the Anderson Coopers of the world. But sorry, I think I cut you off.
Well, I was just thinking, the other thing is there are lots of other governments that give openly to U.S. institutions. I just wanted to name them because I feel like they don't get named enough. And I could feel you were about to end the segment.
Wow.
And I
Wow.
was like, I got to get
You
this.
want to get this in?
Wow.
Please. You know what?
I got to get this out. I have to get this out. Because, okay, so Norway, the country of Norway, is giving millions to the Center for Global Development. Qatar is giving millions to the Brookings Institute. I already said Taiwan and the American Enterprise Institute. UAE giving millions to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Saudi Arabia, millions to the Middle East Institute. These are all the same institutes that are then quoted in media articles about those very same countries and their core national interests. So like massive open foreign nations influence operations are like funding the whole think tank industry in Washington, D.C. I just had to put that out there because it's like, that's the other part about it. It's so selective and hypocritical. It's ridiculous.
No, it's important.
Well,
It's
sometimes,
important.
Ben, just to add to that real quick, sometimes, Ben, those same institutes you mentioned also receive money from the State Department. That's the other hilarious aspect of it. Yeah.
Military contractors spend a huge amount of money on think tanks. No,
Yeah.
it would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. But I think it's critical for people to know that and to find that and to see the influence and how it's going. So we'll of course continue to cover this in a range of different ways. But as always, Dr. Ben Becker, editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, unsurprisingly on point. Thank you so much for offering us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. You're doing great work.
Appreciate that.